Hello everyone, welcome to another week of your favorite class, I'm sure, INST377. I'm really excited. This week we will actually be starting JavaScript. I think last year we I felt that it was kind of rushed, but this year I think we'll actually be able to dedicate the proper time for this, and I'm really excited to start on that. So JavaScript is actually fundamental to this class and to your final project as well. And on that note, I want to please start meeting with your groups. I can't enforce that your groups come to class, but I do recommend that you guys at least meet once in person. And if you're having problems contacting your group members, please contact me ASAP. I want to make sure that you can get in touch with all your group members. As a reminder, those are on Canvas. If you look at the group project lecture, I did show how you can look that up. So please make sure that you do that. I really recommend getting started on at least the team proposal and starting to think about what your project will be. So one of the fundamental technologies that we will be using throughout this course is JavaScript. So I'm really excited to get started on that. And now I want to actually start with looking over our schedule really quick so that we have a understanding of what's going on. So let me hop on over there. All right. So we are obviously on this week, right? 2.18.2.4. So this week we're covering JavaScript 1, and there will be a lab. Now you'll notice next week there is no lab, and that's because your assignment will be being assigned next week. And your assignment for this case is actually 2 weeks. So you have 2 full weeks to do that assignment. And I want to emphasize this significantly because I feel people didn't take this seriously when I said this, but please do not wait until the last day to start the assignment. It will not be good. It is more complex than the lab. There's a lot of moving pieces. So with that, we will talk a lot about that assignment next week. But I also want to point your attention to 3.10. There's a group project team proposal due. So please meet with your groups ASAP. Make sure you can start knocking this out. And the week of 3.10, I actually recommend that you have the whole week. So it might be a good idea to meet in person for that. So just a suggestion. So, okay. And with that, let's get started. All right. So there you go. All right. So this week we are introing JavaScript. And you might first think, oh, Java, fun, object-oriented. Oh, I've learned Java. Unfortunately, JavaScript has no relation to Java despite the name, and in fact is in many ways very, very different. But JavaScript is actually very fundamental to the web and understanding how many of the modern web app stack is built. So it's a really important application, and we'll be covering a good portion of Java, even covering or JavaScript, and even understanding some of the front end and back end. We'll be talking about Node, which you're going to use for your project as well. So I'm really excited for all of that. So with that, let's get started. All right. So first of all, what is JavaScript, right? So is it Java with a script? Well, that would be logical, right? Unfortunately, it's not that. While it may sound like it with the name, it has no actual relation to Java. Syntactically, it has no relation. Like the way it compiles and interprets, no relation. It's called JavaScript. So basically, as a fundamental understanding, once loaded, HTML by itself is powerless, right? So you've seen what we can do with HTML and CSS, etc., right? So we can go create these websites, set the layouts, set the colors, and do all these things. But what happens when we need more complex actions and we want to modify certain elements? Well, HTML and CSS can't do those alone. It is basically static, and it can't do anything reactive, like let's say when this button loads, we wanted to do something or something like that. So JavaScript is the solution. JavaScript is a lightweight interpreted programming language. Now note that is important, right? So if it's not compiled, so it's actually interpreted, so it reads line by line, and that has many benefits, and it's very fast, right? And essentially, it's fast enough that where the browser runs the code using a JS engine. So JavaScript is actually run in the browser. And that's actually very important to understand. So when you're testing JavaScript and or like running JavaScript code, it's important to understand that all the front end JavaScript we build will be run in the browser itself. So the logs, the debugging will all be leveraged in the browser. So that's the best way to debug and test JS. And we'll go over those examples as well. Now, there is an engine called V8, which is actually what runs the code. And V8 was developed by Google, of course. What wasn't developed by Google on the internet, apparently. But V8 is probably the most popular. They pioneered it, and it was just a very fast JS runtime. And it is used today in Chrome and also in Node. Node is a backend technology that has JavaScript, but the backend technology actually uses this JS engine. Okay, so JavaScript. So JavaScript is nowadays, I would say, one of the most popular languages. So it's become, I would say, within the last 10 years, extremely popular for indie devs, for like startups, for even I'm starting to see it across the enterprise stack. It's becoming a very popular language to use. In fact, there has been so much hype around it that there's numerous frameworks built on top of JS. You may have heard of Node.js, right? Or React.js, which are both frameworks built on top of it. Historically, JavaScript is only used in browsers, but is now being used for standalone server applications. So I'll give you actually a quick example from what we do at work. So when we started our microservices and our platform or our tool that we're building, it actually was built in Java. So it was built in standard Java, and we had this distributed stack, etc. And it was very good. But now, actually, as we're hiring more people and, we're trying to scale this application, we're seeing that JavaScript is actually working very well because lightweight apps can actually be used. Like JavaScript is very beneficial. So we're actually moving our whole tech stack over to JavaScript. So we're actually using Node.js in the backend and React.js in the front end. We were already using React, but now we're actually using Node in the front end as well. So it's actually a huge trend, and these are even at big enterprises, right? JavaScript was actually made popular by big tech in general, and we'll talk about that, right? It was backed by big tech. Facebook and Google both poured a lot of resources into JavaScript. Even Microsoft, to some extent, has been very heavy pushing this. And it's used in many mobile and web apps. So there's actually things called React Native, which is like a JS framework used to build mobile apps, cross-platform, which is really beneficial and has its own benefits. And across the web, I would say nowadays almost every modern web app that's being built is JavaScript. It's kind of the go-to right now. It's very easy to learn, right? And it's just easy to build a full stack out of. So you build a front end, back end, and then your database connections. Your back end and front end can be JavaScript and work effortlessly. And there's so many plugins to make your database so easy to work with. There's also a lot of interesting work around games. So games have historically not been great for JavaScript, but recently I've been seeing a lot of innovation, especially in like the indie space around JavaScript gaming. I wouldn't say it's very popular yet, but it's just, it's happening, right? Slowly but surely it's happening. I think there's many years till this actually becomes popular because of technologies like Unity and everything. There's a lot of competing languages, but React is starting to get used for this. There's also one other framework that I've been hearing about recently, and actually when I was teaching this class last semester, I remember hearing about it a lot, called Bun.js, and it's actually a new framework that they're building to make JavaScript super, super fast, right? And it's like blazing fast, essentially, like even faster than it already is. And there was a lot of interesting work around that. I haven't checked in on that project in a while, but it's really interesting. When I was teaching this class last semester, they were actually just releasing it, and I remember seeing it like live on like Twitter as those things were happening. It was really interesting. So yeah. So JavaScript, as I mentioned, runs in a browser. Wow, I can't spell. And as a more historical fact, Ryan Dahl is actually who is actually a founder of Node.js. So remember, Node.js is a backend technology. It basically took that V8 engine and slapped it into a C++ program and made that backend. And that gave us Node.js. And that's a really super fast and lightweight server technology. Again, like I mentioned, our company is moving towards, or like our project is moving towards Node.js. I'm seeing a lot of newer projects move towards it. It's, again, like I said, starting to be adopted across the board. So now, basically, your full stack can be built using JS, your backend, your front end, etc. And, I keep mentioning the stack and everything, but let me talk a little bit more about that because I know that can be confusing. So when you're building a web application, there's usually 3 layers of technologies, right? So there's your front end, which is what is visible to the user. The back end, which is basically what does all your heavy lifting, processing, connections to different APIs, databases, all these things. Maybe taking data, processing it somehow, doing something with it. And then your database, right? Now let's ignore the database for a second because that's not really what we consider full stack. But when we consider a full stack engineer, we talk about front end and back end, right? And now there are different frameworks that can be used from JavaScript for front end and different ones that can be used for back end. So I'll give you an example. So for the front end, many of you might have heard of a technology called React JavaScript. So it's called React.js. And React.js allows you to basically build very, very good UIs very quickly. And then for the backend, there are technologies called Node.js. Node.js allows you to basically run a server in your backend. And then there are also things that are built on top of those as well. So, for example, React.js, there are multiple frameworks that you can build on top of it, or even Node. There are built multiple things like Express, which allow microservice development, etc. But basically, your 2 core technology stack is your front end, which is primarily React, and your back end, which is Node. Now, in this class, we will cover both, actually. But when you're building web apps, you don't need to use any of these technologies, right? They make your life easier, but they're not necessary, right? Like Node.js is required because it's actually a foundational level technology. It actually allows you to run the server, but React.js is an optional framework. So when you build UIs, you can build it with HTML and CSS using or leveraging JavaScript to do certain functions. React.js is not a requirement. But for the backend, when we get there, you need Node.js to actually run the server for you, so that's a requirement. But we will talk about that more later. Now, as I mentioned, all of this is JS, but yeah. Okay, so as we talk about the front end, etc., we need to understand a little bit about this standard called ECMA script. Now, ECMA script is a standard kind of set by a foundation, and JavaScript as a language conforms to this standard. So, JavaScript is a language. It conforms to ECMA script standards. There's slight variations to this, but in general, just good to understand that JavaScript as a language conforms to this ECMA script standard. There's also other languages that conform to the ECMA script standard. You've probably never heard of them. I'm not going to really talk about them, but you can look those up. There's a lot. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about how JS code actually gets compiled. So modern JS interpreters use a method called just-in-time compilation to improve performance. So what this means is the JS source code actually gets compiled into a faster binary format. And despite this, it's still interpreted since the compilation is actually done at runtime rather than ahead of time. So JS is never really compiled ahead of time, but it gets kind of like manipulated into this faster binary type thing and then interpreted. So like there's certain optimizations you can do, etc. And it's called just-in-time compilation. And this is the modern, like, so what most browsers use, etc. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about server-side versus client-side. So what is the server-side? What is the client-side? You might remember from the first lecture, we talked about servers, clients, etc. So there are 2 ways JS code is run. First is server-side and second is client-side. client-side code is run, well, on the client, right? What that means is it's run in your browser. So in web programming, that means the browser, and this is React.js. So React.js is run on the browser. Now, server-side code is run on the server and then displayed to the browser. So this server-side code, let's take out JavaScript. There's multiple languages. Java is server-side, Python is server-side, and then Node.js. Node.js can be considered its own language. It's actually server-side code. And remember, to run server-side code, you probably need to host some sort of server to actually run it, right? So you might need an EC2. You might need, an EC2 is like an AWS server, essentially. So you can rent the EC2. You might need something called a Lambda, which is like a serverless type thing, which you can host code in. There's all kinds of options. Okay, so using JavaScript is actually pretty simple. There's actually, with our HTML and CSS knowledge, we can implement the use of JavaScript quite easily. So to add JavaScript to a page, you just add script tags and place the JavaScript within there. Of course, you can also have an external JavaScript file, and we'll talk more about that next class and how to do that, because as your JavaScript gets complicated, you definitely need to do that. But this is the easiest way, and this is how we're going to get started. Like I mentioned, you can create a scripts folder and put scripts there. So JS by default is loaded upon load of the HTML page if you put it at the top. So it's actually order dependent. So there are ways to bypass this, and in 90% of cases, it is necessary to use the HTML elements from your code. So you need your whole page to load, then your JS. So what you can do actually is you can add a defer. So there's a little tag you can add called defer if you're using external script. And let's say we're using the script tag, we just have to put our code at the end of the body, which is what we're going to do today. Because otherwise what'll happen is, since HTML is order dependent, like let's say you go down to let's say you have the JavaScript at the top. What can happen is some elements might load before your JavaScript is ready, and some might load after. And if they load after, they won't be accessible by the JavaScript. And you'll see why this matters, because JavaScript is very important, and we need to be able to access those HTML elements. So if we put it at the body, if we put it at the end of the body, really easy, we can just, put it there, and the code will be accessible. And okay, so as I was saying, so you can put the code at the end of the body, and basically what'll happen is all the elements will render and then the script will render, so it'll have access to everything else that the HTML page rendered. So that is the preferred way and what we're going to be doing. All right, so now let's learn a little bit about how we can actually use JS and what it's used for. So let's think about this concept of selectors in CSS, right? So we say, I want to modify this div, and I want to change the color of it, right? Pretty simple. In CSS, you put #test, and there you go. You have access to the element, you can change it. But now, in JS, it's a little more advanced. So what you can do is you can use things called query selectors and kind of basically reference any element you want in the script. So what you would do is you would use this document. So this document actually is the top level of the HTML, right? So imagine your HTML page as a whole. We call that a document. So in your code, you would literally write document, and it's like a class that JavaScript has access to. And you would say document dot query selector, and then choose the class that makes sense. So document.query selector code block, right? So I want to choose the code block. And then what I can do is I can do .inner HTML, and then I can do some function. And we'll talk a little bit more about these functions in a minute, but maybe we can alert someone saying, oh, let me see something, right? So yeah, pretty straightforward. So if you look at this code, what's happening is we're saying document, select the code block class, and then get the text from the inner HTML. So that's INST377, and alert saying, I want the user to be alerted, like I want something to pop up on their screen saying INST377. Okay, then what you can also do is you can select multiple. So maybe you want to say, I want to select all divs, right? So you can do query selector all and then do the same thing. Now, what you can also do is you can actually do something called document.getElementById. So sometimes we just want to choose an element by ID, and this is the best way to do that. So document.getElementById allows you to define an ID of an element, right, in the HTML and CSS, or in the HTML, I should say, and then modify it. So once we retrieve any element, we can access certain attributes of the element and modify them. And that's where JavaScript really comes into play. So we can, of course, do the basic things like CSS, where we can change color. We can, we can do whatever we want, right? We can change color, change backgrounds, change whatever. But we can also do some other cool things. For example, we can maybe alert the user, and we'll talk about that in a second. So first of all, let's take a look at what we can change. So let's go over to this link I put. Okay, so now looking at this, there's all kinds of things we can change, right? So we can change all these things. So we can do borders, border images, flex, colors, hyphens, icons, whatever we want. And all we would do is you do document.getElementId.style, right? And then .style whatever you want to put here. So any of these you can put. So you could say .style.color equals red. And basically a style is basically something that JavaScript has access to. So yeah, it's pretty cool. So let's go back here. So yeah, you would do document dot whatever selector, so get element by ID, dot style. So style indicates that I want to access this style. And then whatever style element you want to manipulate, so color. Now you can also do document dot get element by ID dot inner HTML, as we saw, to access like certain HTML things, etc. And I'll show you that later. It's very hard to explain kind of what those are leveraged without showing you, but basically you can manipulate all these things about an object and actually like do some really cool stuff. So you can have dynamic text based on the user's input, right? You could say, oh, okay, if a user inputs 1, show the word odd. If a user inputs 2, show the word even. If they input 3, show odd, etc., right? So there's all these kind of cool things you can do because now you have the dynamism of JavaScript available to you. So in JS, you can actually have all kinds of functions. So JS actually has this alerts function built in, and it's like it's a pop-up on the browser. It helps to create some sort of notification for the user if used correctly. Of course, sometimes it's used maliciously, right? Just spamming you with alerts. But for our use cases, we're not going to be malicious, are we? Please don't. And we're going to try to use it well. And then you can also build custom functions, which we're going to try. And these custom functions can be used for anything, but a very good use case of them is to validate forms. So it'll allow for some very unique validations for very specific use cases. Now, one thing to note is when you're calling a function from form in JS, it must return true or false. And you might ask why? Well, what does it do with it? So, if true, then the action in the form will execute. So, for example, if your action is to go to another page, it'll forward to that page. If false, the action will not proceed. And this is beneficial if you want something like changing a color and you want it to stay on the same page, right? And I'll show you an example of that as well. But essentially, if true, the action in the form will execute. If false, the action will not proceed. And by default, if you don't put any like return true or false, it'll return true, which can cause some issues. So you'll see in the lab, like, you'll want to change colors. So returning true or false is important actually. And you can hard code that as well. And we'll talk about that as well. All right. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about debugging. So when you're testing JavaScript code, there's going to be times you'll be like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what's happening. And so what you can do is you can actually use log statements and you can debug your code. And we'll show that, but basically that's all through the browser. Because if you remember, JavaScript is run on the client side. So it will be visible, the logs, in the browser. So I'll show you how we can do that as well. Okay. And here's an example of something. And we will actually do it ourselves so we can see live what happens, but it's very nice. All right, and with that, it is practice time. So let's do. All right, so now we are on VS Code. Let's get started. So what we're going to do, we'll open up a new file as normal. So we can call it INST377 week 4 JavaScript lecture.html. And for this, we're not really going to focus much on like explicit CSS. We're going to focus on JavaScript itself. But remember, it can be used in conjunction. So don't forget about that. Yikes, what did I do? Okay, so we're going to make a basic HTML file. And in here, we'll have our standard head, we'll put a title, and we'll call this form valid, or we'll call this INST377. Let's call it JS practice. Okay, so cool. All right, now we'll have a body. Okay, and in the body, we will just do some simple stuff. So first we'll do a h1. We'll have the ID equal to word. And we'll write, okay, this element will change colors. You might ask, well, how's it going to change colors? Well, we'll talk about that. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a button. So remember, there's a button in HTML. And we'll call the button change the color. Yes, I will spell it British. Don't know why. I just felt like it. All right. So now let's open up our server, right? Our live server, and see what we have here. Well, it's kind of exactly what we expect, right? This element will change colors, change the color. Obviously, clicking it does nothing, right? So amazing. So we have this, but now let's start adding some magic. So first, let's learn a little bit about what we can actually do. So remember, we can add this thing called a script to the end of the body. Sorry, we'll put it here, called a script. All right. And what we can do here is we can write type equals text / JavaScript. This isn't always necessary, but it's good to be explicit, so why not? All right. And in here, we could literally do anything. So let's take an example of what we did during the lecture. So let's go back to the lecture. Okay, so we want to do something like this. So we're going to do let t equal to document.getElement by ID. And, we set the ID for H1, so we can do ID. And then we'll see what we have here. But if you look here, when you do .getElement by ID, there's actually a lot of options, right? And, we're not going to go through all of them, obviously, but we're going to take the inner HTML. Now you might ask, okay, what is the inner HTML? Well, the inner HTML is, if you think about what is within the H1 tags, or within the tags of what is the ID. So we'll do that. And we'll close that out. So semicolons are optional in JavaScript, but and then we'll write alert and say T. Okay. So let's go back to our browser and go here and go here. And well, it's not working. And that is because I am not very smart. Meant to write word. All right, and look at that. So without me even updating the browser, it went and said, oh, this element will change colors. Now the problem is, obviously, it'll keep doing that. So if you refresh the page, it'll do it again. If you refresh the page, it'll do it again. Wow, shocking. Chrome will probably get tired of me, but pretty cool stuff, right? So now what we're going to do is, let's say we have this element now, right? We have this get element by ID word. Now, first of all, I want to show you what kind of leverage do we have with this. So first, oh my gosh. First of all, let's get rid of the alert. And let's do this thing called console.log. Okay. And here, what we're going to do is we're going to log t, and we're going to say, we're going to add some single quotes here, and say h1 props. Okay. And we're going to get rid of inner HTML. Okay. Now, okay, so we'll look at this and we'll go back here. Now, the first thing you'll say is, I don't see anything. Well, that's right, because remember, we basically did this thing called console.log. And remember, if you remember from the lecture, when you do something like a console or something, your browser is basically what has your like console. Your browser, your client is what's running this code. So if you right click on your browser, there should be an inspect. So go ahead, click inspect. And now you'll see a bunch of buttons here. There should be one called console. So make sure to click that. And now look at this. So now here you have access to see, oh wow, this is everything available to my H1. If you look at this H1 props, and then I see everything. Isn't that cool? So we can also say, let's see. Let's do dot style. And look at that. You can see all the styles available to you, right? Everything, which is very cool, right? And now, let's say, so now here's the really cool part. So now let's say we had this H1, and now we want to change the color. How would you do it? So what you could do is, so we have this let t equal to document. Now, what you can see, we actually, we can do basically document, or we can do t.style, yikes, dot color is equal to red. Okay. And we'll go here and look at that. With that, we have successfully changed our HTML color element. Now you might be like, okay, but why wouldn't I just use CSS? You have a very good point. Now let's start learning about the dynamism and what kind of benefits we get. Okay. So right now we have this button, right? So now there is a property of a button called the on click. Okay. So if we go to W3 button on click, and there's this on click event called on click. And basically what it does is it allows you to call a JavaScript function. And now some of you might be seeing where I'm starting to go with this. So what you could do is you could say on click, do this thing, call this JavaScript function. So what we can do here is, let's say, function change color. Go here, and you have to put some curly braces and etc. We'll go here. And now here in the button, what we'll do is we'll write on click equals change color, and make sure to have parentheses. It's very important. All right. And do I need single quote? You can do single or double, just personal preference. Okay, so now let's go back to our HTML page. Now you'll see, okay, it's black, great, it looks fine. Now what I can do is change the color, and look at that. It is now red. Isn't that so cool? So now you can imagine the kind of endless possibilities we have, right? Because now we can do basically anything by using event-driven decisions, right? We can say, based on this event, do something. And it's so cool, right? So you can do hundreds and thousands of things. And that's where all this like kind of magic starts happening, right? So now let's actually make this a little more better, right? So right now we have this change color, right? Or sorry, we have this change color, and you know, once it changes color, we can't do anything unless we refresh the page, etc. So let's make this a little more advanced, right? let's go ahead and kind of, let's say we want to say, you know, if it's red, change it to something else. Or if it's black, change it to red, right? So if it's red, change it to black. If it's black, change it to red. So how would we do that? Well, if any of you are familiar with like standard, I would say, decisioning based systems in code, we could do something like, so we could say, let t equal to document.get element by ID word dot style dot color. Okay, get rid of this. So now we can say if t is equal to black, then set t equal to red. Else t is equal to black. So basically we're saying if it's set to black, change it to red. But else, if it's any other color, but it'll only be red, change it back to black, right? And theoretically, that should work. Now, again, there are some assumptions I'm making here, right? First of all, this is a very, very basic level JavaScript. I don't expect you to yet know very advanced JavaScript. This is kind of just like basic run-of-the-mill, like just like ifs and elses kind of, and just basic variable things. So let's, const, those are variable types in JavaScript. We'll get a lot more in depth into those next week, but for now, you know, just use a let. You don't even have to use a variable. Doesn't really matter. I'm just doing it for succinctness. So now we'll take this and we'll start changing. Okay, sorry. All right, so now you can see I'm doing something wrong. So I'm clicking change the color, but it's not working. So first of all, let's figure out why. So first, let's go and log something, right? So let's do a console.log t. Okay. Okay, and let's go see what's happening. So we'll click here, change the color, and you can see, looks like nothing is being printed out. Why? So let's go see. So we're trying to say let t equal to document.get element by ID dot style dot color. Okay, so it's looking like, you know, it's just not working, right? Like why is there no color element, right? So what we can do is we can say color here, put a comma, and make sure that we're not going clinically insane. And you can see, nothing is showing up, just color. That's odd. So let's do this. Let's just print out the style, nothing else. Okay, change the color. Now look at this. So now we have access to all the style elements. Now let's go open this up and find the color. Well, would you look at that? The color is blank. Why is that? Well, when you haven't modified any CSS element, the color by itself is null or empty, right? So it's like, that's kind of odd, right? So what you can do actually is you can say or t equals no, or t equals no. Okay, now let's see if this fixes it. Well, oh, sorry. You have to change it back to style.color. My bad. That didn't fix it. And that's probably because the element doesn't actually have any value. So what we can do actually is we can be a little better about this. So we can say if t equals red, since we'd be explicitly setting it, change it to black, else set it to red. Okay, so now we'll go back, change the color, and we still don't see the color. So my bad. Let's go back here. Okay, so if t is equal to red, which it's not, set t equal to black. Else, t is equal to red. So, okay. So, what if we... what if we did this? Okay, so after some digging, I found my issue. So, oddly enough, I could not use the variable t. I don't know why. But I could say, okay, set document.getElementId.style.color equal to black, or document.style.color equal to red. And, you know, what I can do is I can clear this out. Okay. And put this here. There you go. And get rid of this. And do a color. And you might wonder, okay, why did it not work with the variable? Well, the variable's access to the HTML actually doesn't work properly sometimes. So sometimes you have to directly say, I want to set the color of this to this, because the variable is a pointer to the actual value. So you have to say, I want to set the actual value to something. But if you say, I want to set the variable to something, it's not changing the actual value. And that was my mistake. So what you should do is actually do document equals black or equals red. And my apologies for that. That's a miss on my front, but it's a learning experience. Pretty good to know. So now we can go back, change the color, and look at that. Isn't that magical? It's amazing. I love it. It's so much fun. So now we can change whatever. And we could make this even more fun. We could do a random list of colors. We could change it into anything. But for now, that's all we're going to do. Okay? So now with that, we've done that. But if you remember, there was one more thing I talked about. And that was the basically the form validation. So first of all, we're going to make a new HTML file. I realized I named this file wrong, so I'm going to fix that. Okay. And so we're going to create a new file because I kind of want to like use some, like have both files available for us for whatever reason. So _javascript underscore lecture.html. Okay, perfect. So with that, what we're going to do now is set up the same basic HTML stuff, you know, nothing crazy. Just put our standard title here. Okay, we'll call it form valid, or we'll call it INST377 form validation. Okay. Create the body. And remember, at the end of the body, we'll have a script. So I'll put that there. And I'm going to do type equals text/JavaScript. Now, I did see this error a little bit last year. Make sure it says text/JavaScript. Some people put something else and then it didn't work. So make sure you're putting text/JavaScript, not anything else. Otherwise, it will break. It doesn't like it. So, yeah. So make sure that's correct. Okay. So now here we'll create a very simple form. Okay. So, you know, we'll just create some simple form here. Yikes, form, and we'll say name equals, you know, contact form, right? And here we'll put a label, first name, and we'll have some input. So we'll put an input type equals text, placeholder equals John, and ID equals first name. And then we'll put a breakpoint here, and then we'll put an input type equals submit. Okay. Now, you might remember last time when we talked about forms, we talked about having an action with the form, right? So it's very important that we have this action because the action indicates that we're doing something. Now, if you have no action there, by default, what it'll do is it'll refresh the page. Okay, so I'll leave it. I want to show that something is happening, so I'll put some, I'll tell it to go to google.com, right? So we'll have something there. And if you remember for the button, we had that on click, right? So if you go back, we had this on click. Now for forms, it's slightly different. It's on submit, okay? It's on submit. And for on submit, what you can do is you can do, you can call your JavaScript function as expected. So we'll go over what we're doing here. So now let's go over and look at what we have so far. Okay, so we have this, you know, we can put whatever, but Jane, whatever, submit, and it goes to google.com, right? Because remember, we have an action. Now, there's multiple reasons why, you know, you might not want it to do that, right? So first of all, let's get rid of this action and see what happens. Okay. So we got rid of the action. Now we click Jane, submit, and you can see it gets rid of Jane and basically refreshes. So you can see here. So watch this part of my screen, Jane. You can see it refreshes, right? So anytime I submit something, it refreshes the page. So there are benefits to that, but there's also drawbacks, and there's also ways to mitigate that, and we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so now we have this thing. Now, what if I create this form, but now some malicious person is coming in and trying to put SQL text in there. Now, for some of you might be familiar, but there's this hack called an SQL injection attack. It's a very common attack, very well known how to counter it as well. And basically this SQL injection could basically release your very sensitive customer data to the whole world. And nowadays there's a lot of things to protect against it. There's built-in validations, like many of the database providers have those built into their ORMs, etc. But it's good to know, right? So what I can do basically is I can take this thing, and let's say I did select star from table, right? I could run this exact command, run submit, and if I had access to a database, that could maliciously get me data. Now, how do we prevent it against that? So before, if you remember, we would put a required field, right, to say, okay, require this. But how do we actually validate that this is coming in as expected? So what we can do is on submit, we can call a validate function. So we can run return validate. Now remember, this return is important, so we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so let's go talk about how we can do this. So we're going to create a function called validate. Function validate. Okay. Okay. Now, in this function, we need to basically say, okay, if this data has certain things, then that's bad, right? So, like, you know, bad, right? So how do we do that? So I'm going to just give you like the solution here because I don't expect you to know this right now. But basically, we can run this thing called a validation test. But first, let's do this. First, let's say I want to say I want this name to be required, right? So we could put the required here, and it would do this, right? And that's fine, right? That works, right? But let's say I want I want the user, I want it to pop out for the user. So what I can do actually is in the validate function, I can say if document dot, and now what you'll do is you'll say the name of the element or the name of the form. So it's called contact form. Document dot contact form dot the name of the or the ID of the element that you want to validate, first name, dot value. So value indicates whatever they submitted, okay, is equal to empty, right? Then alert. Enter, or sorry, it should be single quotes. Enter a first name. And then here we're going to return false, and you'll see why we'll do that in a second. Okay. Okay. So now I'm not going to enter anything. Oh no, enter a first name. Now, what you'll see is it won't go to Google, right? Did you notice that? It didn't go to Google. So if I put something here, Jane, oh, come on, Jane, now it's going to Google, right? Or sorry, it should return true, my bad. By default, it should return true. Okay. So if I put something here, now it'll return apparently nothing. Oh, did I remove the Google redirection? My bad. I did. Oh, silly me. Okay. All right, so I'll put Jane here. I went to Google, and now let's say I don't put anything here. It'll say John, and it won't return to Google. Did you see that? It didn't refresh the page. It just stayed there, and it said, no, you're not moving. We're going to keep you on this page, right? So that was important. Okay. So now what we've done is we've said, okay, if you don't have any value in here, great, enter something, otherwise we won't let you move on, okay? Now that's good, but what if I also want to protect against SQL injections? So what I can do is actually I can run this validation against it. So I can say, I want you to test that there are no illegal characters in this code. Now I'm going to give you guys this, right? So this is in the file I upload, but there's basically this list of characters that I want you to check against. So I've already included it. I don't expect you to remember all these characters, but yes. Now what you can do is you can say, okay, great. So else if validation, right? So you take the variable validation dot test. So this is a JavaScript function. I don't expect you to know that off the top of my head. And then you say, okay, if document dot take that. And so basically it's saying if validation.test is true. So if this comes back as, oh, this like something is there, like there is a injection character, then run an alert to say, how about nah? And then we do return false. Okay. So now let's go test this out. So select star from table, submit, and look at that. It says, how about nah? Right? Great. It's great. It works well. Okay. So now let's say we want to make this a little fancier, right? Let's say we say, when you insert something bad, I want to change the color of the page to say red. Okay. So what I can do is do document.body dot background, or sorry, it should be document.body.style dot background color equal to red. Now you might ask, okay, what that'll do? So now we're going to put a bad thing and say submit. How about nah? And look at that. It makes the page red. Isn't that sick? Okay, I know. I'm sorry. I love this stuff, but this is so cool. All right. And you could even flip this around and put this above so it turns red first and then alerts. So, whatever you like, whatever floats your boat. But now I want to show you one more thing. So let's say I remove this action here. Okay. And I didn't return anything. Okay. So let's say I got rid of the returns. I want to show you what would happen. Okay. So I'm going to run this, submit, and looks fine. Enter a first name, great. But notice again, it refreshes. But let's see how that actually impacts us. So now I'm going to run a select star from table, submit. It says, how about now? Changes red and then flashes back. And did you see that? I want to show you that again. I think this is important. It submits, shows the alert, flashes red, and then turns back. And that's because we don't have the return, right? And the reason because it's when it's returning nothing, right? It's basically returning true, essentially. It's basically like, oh, okay, it validated, so I'll just refresh the page, right? The action by default is refresh the page, right? So if, for example, right, I went back and sorry, I'm randomly doing stuff. I put https://www.google.com, and I just did this. Select star from table. It would say, how about now? Flash red, and then go to Google. So now I've bypassed any like security measure I just put, right? Because, you know, in this case, we're going to Google, but what if that was an actual action I wanted to happen? Could have been a malicious thing that we wanted. Like maybe it would have submitted something to my website. So it's really bad. So that's why returns are super important. So if there's an error, you should always return false. Or if you want like an action to happen and you don't want the page to refresh, which kind of is on your lab too, make sure to return false. Otherwise it won't work. Okay. So now with that, you know, we go here. There you go. All right, cool. So pretty cool stuff. Now, I encourage you to really try out all these things. I mean, there's so much fun things you can do in JavaScript. I'm sure some of you are even familiar with it. So please feel free to be as creative as you want. And yeah, I think this is just a lot of fun, right? So there's just a lot of fun to have here. So with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope you guys can learn a lot from this. And we'll be covering a lot more in depth next week in week 5. We'll be covering a lot more about the basics of JavaScript, and I kind of just wanted to get us started and show you how we can validate stuff and run alerts. But next week we'll be covering it much more in depth, talking about lets, const, vars, just basics of JavaScript, so we understand that stuff. And then, you know, we're going to hit the ground running from there. So with that, please try this stuff because it's very hard to grasp what's happening until you try it. So please try this, and please reach out if you have any questions, and please don't forget to do your project. So with that, thank you all, and I will see you all next week.